Thank you for listening to this episode. Make sure you come back for the next episode covering the points of this conversation.
And follow the podcast on social media by finding @PrestigiouSPod.
Follow me, Mr. Kent, at Mr. Chris R. Kent.
Follow me, Chris Bean, at Chris Bean Official.
Join our Discord for exclusive content and personal interactions.
And if you'd like to be coached on how to live a more prestigious life, you can reach out to me, Chris Bean, on one of my social media platforms, or by emailing the podcast directly at prestigiousInitiative@gmail.com.
Lastly, sign up for our newsletter either through social media or on our website.
This is the Prestigious Initiative. Welcome. I'm Chris Bean. Today, I have a fantastic guest with me, joining me here today. We're ready to dive into the fascinating world of leadership and team management. Welcome, John. John Thornton, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing excellent. So can you give us a little bit about who you are and kind of what we're going to go through today?
Yeah, so my name's John, obviously. I've been in software engineering for about 10, 15 years at this point. A lot of that time has been either, I would say about 7 to 8 years of that has been me either leading teams or managing teams from the various degrees. I started out doing some consulting work where I had to manage clients and customers and kind of building mobile applications for them. And then I started helping companies bring stuff in-house. So a lot of transitioning applications that were built by other people, bringing them in, and then we would rebuild them. And then eventually I started leading those teams, helping other team members grow, making sure that they could do the same things that I was doing, and then helping companies scale their practices and scale what they could do and build internally. Like I said, I've a lot of leading. And then the last 4 or 5 years, I've been doing a lot more of managing, which I think those are a little bit of when you talk in the world of software, those are very different things. You're kind of leading projects, but managing is where you're actually caring about team members. You may be leading multiple projects, but you're caring about team members, making sure they excel and giving feedback. So it's a very interesting dynamic that I've had to learn the last 4 to 5 years of how you shift from leading to managing.
Well, and that's an interesting take too, because you talked about when you're managing, you are caring about the people that are under you, which is not necessarily the phrasing that generally people would associate with managing on either end, both as a manager or as somebody who is just a regular worker who has a manager. That caring aspect, I'm sure, is not there all the time, and I can imagine that leads to a different type of relationship that you have with those people that are working for you.
Yeah, managing is definitely a tough balance, because there is an inherent, when you talk about managing, there's an inherent power difference because most companies have a hierarchy. My management style is definitely a little bit more leaning towards caring about the people and trying to make them feel supported without necessarily asserting authority. I think if you can find the balance of having a group of individuals who are all directed at the same target willingly rather than demanded, it's definitely, you're going to get better output. You're going to get better, just better results. And then on the other side of it, they're going to feel better. They're going to be proud of the work they built. They're not just going to say, well, I did this, and then they're going to walk away. Though by the nature of kind of pointing them and giving them direction, they're going to feel that ownership, and then they'll really you'll see team members excel. At least that's been my experience.
Now, as you've been in the work field, I'm sure you've been on both sides. You've had some good managers and some good leaders and some bad managers and some bad leaders. Did you have any specific training that you went through to develop this style, or is this kind of just happened over time by seeing what works and what doesn't work?
It's a really good question. Up until about last year, I did a formal management training. But I think, especially when it comes to where I've been, having really good examples and things that I've liked and has been very, very helpful. And I don't think any of them actually had any formal management training. And I think, especially when you come from software, the way it works, and I'm sure this happens everywhere else, but like I said, I've been in software for 10 to 15 years. Previously, I was working at gas stations. So I went college straight into software. So my experience of Other team management outside of software is very limited, so I try to stay here. But for me, yeah, I've had really good ones. And the way we work up is you go from developer, engineer, you start leading teams, and then you go to management. None of those levels have a management training. You're very focused on being an individual contributor. So you're sort of, all right, I'm building functionality, I'm learning to work with cross-functional stakeholders and peers. And then you kind of get up through the ranks, and then eventually someone's like, you know what, you seem like you have very good emotional intelligence. Now we think it'd be good for you to become a manager. And usually people see that it used to be back in the day where it was the only way you can make more money is you become a manager. That's where I think some of the bad managers come from, but also the fact that there's no real formal training that a lot of us go through. But you start kind of having that empathy. And then the management training I went through was very much more of how do you have better one-on-ones? How do you deliver better feedback? How do you do better strategy planning, things like that, that are a little bit more manager side of it, not necessarily tech manager side of it. And those are things that you don't really learn as a individual contributor. Like I didn't really, I mean, learning and getting better at my one-on-ones is something that's always better to do. But having those other mentors in my life that were really good, I have like 3 or 4 managers that I think were really, really good. And they've given me a ton of ways to act and also have helped me shape who I am because I've made mistakes that I've seen even my own team members make. You say something really not smart on a call in front of people, then you know this manager's like, hey, don't do that again. You get called out. But then I've also had a couple bad managers where I've been like, that is exactly what I don't want. And I've modeled my current behavior off of like, that's not the type of team I would like to be a part of myself. So I immediately like we kind of like steer your entire team away from doing that. But it's been overall, mentor's been super beneficial for me.
Yeah, I can imagine. And being allowed, I think, to make those mistakes, I think is essential because it's important that we make those mistakes because otherwise we don't know why that was bad, right? If you get an opportunity to go through that and you're dealing with people, you make that mistake and you're kind of on quote unquote like a big stage, people are there watching, or other people are impacted by that mistake that you made. You feel the pressure of that. And because you get to go through that experience, you get to learn, okay, yep, I know not to do that again. And then you can grow from that. Whereas if somebody tells you that and it's devoid of that, like if you tell your subordinate who perhaps wasn't there at the time when the mistake was made, hey, don't make this mistake because I did this. And, maybe that would have a little bit of extra weight because you're telling them that, hey, I made this mistake. But if you're just learning this in a class devoid of all of the extra pressures that go with, actually interacting with people, then it doesn't have the same impact. So I think that, allowing those managers, those mentors that you had that allowed you to go through those things and fail so that you could learn and grow from that on the other side, I think is very impactful.
It is. And I would also add that having the people that make the mistake be part of the solution as well to fixing it. Like sometimes a mistake is very easy. You said something in a call, you should just not repeat that ever again. Sometimes it has you miss the timeline and now you have other team members that are impacted and there's a little bit more of a cascading effect. So the other thing is you then support them all the way back out of that failure. I think that is also key because then they see the actual impact as well. Because some people I've seen where they'll like, all right, now I'm going to step in and I will help you fix it. And they kind of take over. They don't necessarily, the person who failed doesn't see all the impacts. And then the learning is cut short. So I think that is also key to make sure that you're supporting them all the way through it.
Absolutely. 100% agree with that. Very good. Now, in your experience, let's say if you had to name 3, let's detail 3 key elements that would contribute to effective project management for your team that helps to foster their success. What would be 3 key elements for that?
I think the first one is just planning in project management. Now, software is definitely tough because when you see something on paper, you kind of understand a project and then you look at it and you spec it out and see, like, I think I can do this in 2 weeks, a month, but you really don't know until you get your hands on the keyboard and then something messes up and kind of changes. But what you can do up front is you can spend some time planning how long it's going to take you, what elements you're going to take, what elements you're going to do, And then if you plan up front, you can quickly see how quickly you've gone off the rails if you do. So setting up at least a baseline of here's what I think how long it'll take, here's some elements, and tracking towards that is key for every project. The second one I would say is actually transparency, because in software, we don't, we're responsible for a lot of things, and we have a lot of cross-functional partners. Usually we're building something for either a project manager or a different department, or we're just building a feature set that could go live by a date. Having that transparency with everybody that is involved in the project to say where you really are. Hey, we're behind, we're ahead, I think is important because you're building trust with all of your counterparts, but then it forces you to be real with yourself. As I've noticed a lot of people, including myself, throughout my career, where I have an inflated sense of where I'm actually at. And when you have to articulate it to someone else, it gives you a sense of where you really are at versus where you think you're at. And then I would say the other one is just giving yourself time to take care of the small things. A lot of people will say, I'm going to do this in I'll say a month. They've got a huge plan. They think they've caught everything, and then they commit to that 2 months. They don't give themselves any time for messing up, things they forgot. So building in a buffer into everything you do. Now, to be clear here, we're not saying sandbag. Don't say, well, I can get this done in a week, and say, but actually then outwardly commit to 4. But be realistic with your skills, and making sure that you kind of account for your unknowns is key. So I think those are the 3 big things. And then after that, depending on your seniority, you have execution and all those other things that you keep in mind. But the teams I've been working on probably for the last few years, I work at a startup. I've worked at 2 startups, and then I worked at an enterprise. All of those groups have a group of individuals who are very senior, and meaning they know how to get themselves out of situations pretty quick. So the execution part is actually the easiest part for them because that's what they've been doing for career.
Now, with the planning process, of course, so you have the planning process. You set up key milestones to try to hit, maybe not OKRs, but similar, milestone type of ideas. Okay, we're building, and this is, I'm sure, is a tough. In your sector that you're in, it's a tough thing to navigate because sometimes you're doing this and it's similar to something you've done before, probably, or you're doing something that's completely wildly different than anything you've ever done before. And so trying to plan this out, putting it on paper is one task. But then when you're actually going about creating it, because you are essentially a lot of times, I'm sure, creating everything from scratch. Sure, you might be able to plug and play a couple things, but really it's all brand new every time you do something like this. And I certainly can see that trying to rewrite, the alphabet every couple of months is a challenge. And because of that, you have to make sure there's certain checks and balances in place. And of course, with the transparency effect, you have to be clear with your team. Your team has to be clear with you. And then you have to be able to negotiate whatever that is with whoever the client is so that they can have a understanding of where you're at in the process. And when the updated, further back or earlier timeline would be for whatever the product that you're trying to build is. But that is I'm sure very, kind of a juggling act because you're writing, you're making these things from scratch. It's not like, you're building something that's been built before. You're doing it, brand new.
Yeah, and usually when like a client asks you for something, they ask you for everything they want. So when it gets down to like the very end of the timeline, it's very much, all right, do we need more time? Do we bring in more people? Do we make it cost more? Or do we cut scope? So I think like in project management, you're right, because it's such a juggling act and you're not guessing. I would say it's educated guessing. There is an art to it for sure. But also the way we produce our estimates in software is very much, we don't usually, at least the teams I've been on and what I push for is we don't say it's going to take days. We operate in the time frames of weeks. So that way we don't have to get to the micro. And usually if I'm like estimating a project, I'm even throwing out like what are called like sprints, which is basically 2-week segments. So I will say like, hey, I think this is 3 sprints. So actually 6 weeks. So it gives a lot of wiggle room, which that does help with the project management. So you're not juggling as much because you're always dealing with a degree of uncertainty. And that's where the transparency part is important, right? Because then everybody understands what's your scale you're kind of acting on, and then you become partners. A lot of what we do in software engineering is we're partnering with other groups. Like I have sometimes it's product management, sometimes product owners, businesses, but you're kind of partnering with another group and to build their vision along with some of your own. So it's very much a symbiotic relationship. So you have to be very good at those communication lines, which is not something you would expect from a software engineering group. When I graduated, it was like, I'm just going to go and I'm going to start writing on the keyboard. I found out throughout my years that talking to people and establishing those relationships is actually extremely important.
Well, okay, so you're talking about relationships. We talked about building a team. Let's think about how. So having a team is one step, but making sure each of those team members are in their quote unquote proper placement on that team, I think is another kind of aspect that is important to being a leader, being a manager. So can you share some insights on how you would strategically organize or structure your team to have maximum efficiency for collaboration and for getting that work done?
There's a lot of inputs you take into when you're establishing a team. I think, especially when it comes to depending on how you structure your team, there's a lot of different avenues. Basically, there's a group of, hey, I want to build a brand new team, and they're going to build a brand new product. That could mean you have to staff them with a significantly different amount of skill sets than normal, or you're just going to build a feature set of a team. What is interesting is the biggest thing I do is I just try to talk to my employees weekly, one-on-one feedback information. The goal there is know what they're working on, know where they want to go with their career. And that's something that is important for if you're an employee talking to your manager, help your manager understand where you're going, where you would want to go with your career. Because when these projects come up, your manager should be ideally looking out for you to place you in a project. So even if you're underskilled, say I have a brand new project and I have an underskilled individual who may not be as successful on the project, but has the want to be there. And then I have another individual who's completely skilled, but definitely doesn't want to be on that project. It's easier to put the person who is a little bit underskilled and help them upskill, train them, give them extra training, and put them on that project because they're going to have the motivation to succeed on that project. So that's kind of the way you look at it. And then you look at seniority, which is one big thing. How good is the person at the work they're going to be doing? You look at the domain that they're moving into. Does this person actually have knowledge from a business aspect in that domain? For example, have they worked on a product similar to this, or have they worked on an adjacent product? If they move into that team, then they'll have a lot of more business domain knowledge. They'll have a little bit more expertise. They should move faster. They'll understand it better. They'll be more opinionated rather than someone who's never hired, brand new. You got to train them in both the tech stack and the business domain. Then you have to look at what is the business's tolerance for all this? How much is the business risk adverse? Are they wanting to move fast? Is it something that can be a slow burn? You take all those factors in, and then you start building out a team. So if it's a slow burn project that is low risk, you can definitely take people who are a little bit less experienced. If it's a high paced project, high importance, can't mess it up on delivery, right? Then you're going to pull in a little bit more senior people. It's going to be a little bit more senior development, top heavy team with maybe a little bit more juniors. Or you kind of have more support structures built in for that team. So there's really no one size fits all science to it all. It's very much situational based. And then you really just start diving into the last big one is actually what projects can you pull from? Today's day and age, impacting other projects is just as important as building a new one. And the answer is not always hire. Sometimes the answer is hire more people. It's not always the best answer because then if that project ends up getting canned or fails or something else happens, then now you've got more responsibility for individuals. So I think you just start balancing all of that giant bubble of things. And I'm sure there's many more things I'm forgetting, but just having to balance all that when you're building a team is important so that you're setting those individuals up for success, which also could mean you're spending more time on that project based on who's on it, the importance of it. and letting other responsibilities fail. So then you may be actually impacting other people too.
Well, okay, so I want to go in a couple different directions from that. That was
Mhm.
really kind of interesting. So transparency. Most of our listeners know this. I think you probably know this as well. I've never had a quote unquote real job, and so the manager employee type of relationship is a skewed kind of idea for me because I went from being employee sort of quote unquote I was helping. So I'm a martial arts instructor, if you didn't already know that. I started as helping teaching classes. Then I was like, as like a tweak kind of, help this little person, help this little things, set things up behind the scenes. Then being a quote unquote an assistant instructor. Then I started to actually lead the classes. Now I am in, then I moved, I guess, to leading all of the classes, writing the documentation of what's being taught, how it's being taught. And now where I am now, I'm doing all of that. Plus I am leading a team. I'm managing the teaching staff. I'm actively in the process of training not a replacement for me because I'm not going anywhere, but another version of me to go and do what I do at another school. So I went through probably, a similar type of transition as most people have went through, but just in a little bit different type of atmosphere. I've only ever had really one job. So all that to say is the idea of having a weekly meeting with the manager to connect, and then I really liked that you talked about getting feedback from that employee on what their perspectives are. What do they want? What is their next, something like what is their next year? What is their next 5 years? What do they want next type of thing? And then what that does for you as the manager, you get to know that. You get to say, okay, great. They want this next. I have, this thing that's coming up down the pipeline. It's not necessarily important for them to know this yet. And then it gets closer and then boom, you can put them into those shoes. They get to feel accomplished because they're doing something new. They're doing something that they want to do. You feel accomplished because you put them into that role, into that responsibility. And they really, I'm sure, take on that role because it's something that they want, something that they worked for, something they strive for. And then they have a sense of wanting to, I'm sure, kind of prove themselves in that new realm, one to you, but also to themselves. And so I'm sure that works out really, really well. My question is, with this weekly type of meeting, okay, number one, how much time does that take? And then I guess how much of that weekly meeting is repetitious based on what they did or what you talked about in the last week?
That's a good question. So my one-on-ones, I do an hour a week with my reports. So I only have 5, 6. I think previously I actually at one point had 12 reports at a different company, which is way too many. So right now I have 6 reports or 5 reports. And what's interesting is we're a remote culture. So I think it's extra important to connect with your teammates and your employees regularly, especially those who you're reporting to. So as I'm getting pulled in different directions, I almost at times may not truly lose touch, but I am not as focused on the things that they're doing because I'm helping do other things. So having that connection weekly of like, hey, are you struggling? Maybe there was a call that I wasn't on that I should have been on, but I was double booked or something, and then something went awry. So having that touch point with them weekly is just important, just like how they're doing, what are they struggling with, be a sounding board. And honestly, if they don't want, it's kind of one of those things where if it doesn't take the whole hour, that's okay. If they would like to change it to be bi-weekly, that's okay. It's kind of at their discretion, but it's really a way to establish a relationship and an ongoing relationship with people. But it's still super important. Now the previous week stuff is kind of like 50-50. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the projects they're working on. So my manager, he calls that tactical. You have the tactical meeting, and a lot of one-on-ones when I started were very tactical. It was always like, how are things going? What do you want? Like, it was a lot less career development. Now there's another segment. So that's the kind of stuff that may repeat week over week, where you're kind of seeing trends and temperatures week over week of how they're doing. And those sometimes can take the entire hour where you're actually just trying to help them solve a problem, or they can be 5 minutes, but yeah, everything's going well. I'm just on track, no problems, right? And then it starts going into other conversations. So I will spend sometime I will just spend a half hour just talking to them in general, just about things that they're liking, they're not liking, and that's just more of a way to connect to them, right? I'm not in the office with them. I don't get to go to lunch with them. I don't get to, stop at the coffee machine and talk to them all the time. So that this is a little bit more of an extra step into having the one-on-ones. And then I try to sprinkle in career conversations. That's where it's really tough because I used to be very similar in the thought of, well, my manager should kind of know what I want to do with my career, right? They're in the hierarchy. Shouldn't I just fill into that hierarchy and I just want to continue to move up? Like that's the way I started out thinking. And then I started realizing, like, oh, I should be more voicing the angles I want to take. And I think one manager I had actually started talking to me, what actually excites you about coming into work? What does not excite you? And I think when you start getting into the higher roles, you started mastering domains. So you are an expert at teaching classes and you're an expert at karate for sure. Right. But now that's second nature for you. Now it's like, what are the other aspects of running a business do you want to learn or things like that? And that's where you need to have the employees need to be willing to think through that just a little bit. And it doesn't have to be perfect. And the way I look at it is if I ask you what you're going to be doing in 5 years, you're probably going to laugh and joke a little bit because you're just not going to have a clear picture. But you may have some semblance of an idea that you want to be doing. Or if you can't think that far ahead, what do you want to be doing in 2 years? Or whose job do you think looks fun? Let's talk about that. Just so that way you don't just get stuck in the day to day. There's some people are okay, and some people are okay just staying as a senior engineer for the rest of their life doing the same thing. That's their prerogative. There's nothing wrong with that. Those employees are extremely valuable. But other people would like to push their skill sets, their boundaries, and learning that helps. Like if you have someone on your team that wants to be a manager and you're a manager, give them little things that you do to give them exposure because they may not actually want to do all of management. There's a lot to do behind it. So it helps inform them as well. So there's just having that relationship is powerful because then you know what to delegate to because you can't be everywhere, right? You being able to scale yourself is huge.
So, okay, we're going to hone in on this just a little bit. As you're meeting with these people weekly, you get 6 or so people you're meeting with. Are you taking notes to help to refresh your memory? Do you have like a notepad for Sally, and you're writing all the things, the important things, so you know where she's at, what she's doing, what her next steps will be, what she wants to do, or is this just kind of back cataloged in your brain? I'm just starting to for me, I'm a very I kind of think of it in systems and type of things, and so I would make something like a Notion template, and I would have kind of like my couple prompting questions in there, and then I would have an opportunity to write things in, and then that would all be linked into the tag that was Susie or whatever, and then every time I go, I take 2 minutes before I meet with her and just kind of get the top level things. Okay, great. Then I go. Do you have something like that, or is it just kind of free flowing?
In the meeting, it's free flowing. I do keep notes. I tend to do any feedback I give. I tend to keep a note of that. When it comes to work management, we have systems for that. So I don't really need to keep track of what projects they did because I can always go back and look that up. I will keep key feedback sessions, key achievements. I started in the last 2-3 years keeping track of. Previously, I was very much just a digest it all, and I would just remember it. I have a very good memory. I'm blessed with that. But the more I've started doing this, the more I'm like, I don't even want to have to think about that. I just want it in front of me when I'm meeting with them, so I can take note of that and just kind of act on it. And then I also take note of any feedback they give me. So I try to keep a running note for every individual. It's not necessarily like a template, but I have broken out. Here's feedback I've given them. We have a tool for their quarterly priorities. What priorities are they working on? So that way I can see kind of the whole digest in front of me. And then, we just kind of work off that. But I also expect that the individual it's also their meeting. So they bring topics up to me ideally too. So that way, and then when they do performance reviews yearly and things like that, they kind of do their own, I do mine. So it's kind of like a comparing of notes type of thing. But we do quarterly alignments and stuff like that too. So it's all taken in notes and written down usually.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I maybe at one point in time, I probably could remember most of those things, kind of off the cuff, but I don't think I'm there anymore. So as we're talking about structuring the teams and trying to figure out, okay, who's a good fit for these things. And maybe this is different because lots of the work that you do, your team members are remote. And so maybe there's a different connective piece than there. However, my secondary question, that was the first question, is about, the weekly meetings. My second thing is there a personality inference or connection that you try to make? So you put people that are, like-minded, they work together well, they go into this group, and then as you're building another group, they go in, how much of that personality part does that play as you're trying to select your specific team members?
It plays a lot into it, but I don't know if it would be as you expect on this one. So I have individuals who have been working together for a very long time. I've had that at various jobs. And what you find is like they work really well together, and they have a really good culture between them. And what happens is you start wanting to have that culture be more prevalent in an organization. So what you can do is sometimes you keep them together and you have them, they execute on a project really well. You move them over there, they're going to execute, they're going to knock it out, high reward, but they kind of just continue to click off inside of the organization. And if they're very talented individuals, you want them to spread that culture. So at times it actually may make more sense to pull them apart and have them in a very similar situation. So that way, that culturally they can still connect with each other. Like, hey, I'm having this problem. How do I solve it? So maybe if there are two lead engineers on the same project or two very senior, you pull them off and make them lead engineers on another project. They're leading it. They're hitting the same problems. Their connection already is going to be beneficial. And then you may bring on someone who is still learning to drive that culture, or is like on the fringe of it, and you want them to adopt that culture. So then you kind of put them on there. So then they start bringing that culture together, and then you start scaling that culture. And I think that's important. But yes, personalities for sure. If you can't have some individuals are very quiet. You can't just have a group of 5 quiet people on a team. That's not going to be successful. What you can do though is you may have 4 really quiet individuals who are very talented at what they do, and then you have a 5th one who likes to talk, wants to lead, and they can be the voice for that group. But that leader may not even be the most skilled hands-on keyboard feature builder, but they've got the other skills to help be the voice. So you take into account of that, and that's where knowing where people, like, what motivates them from the one-on-ones. If they just like, I do not want to be the face of a project, I don't want to be doing the presentations, great. That they're not going to want to do it. So if you don't have to put them there, don't, and let them be your rock star somewhere else. It's kind of the way I would look at it. And again, it's situational, but culture is very important. And if you can get individuals to scale their culture and make more friends, more connections, especially being remote's very easily to isolate yourself. Then that's the way I would do it. May not work for everyone. There may be 2 people that work really well together, and then when they're separated, they actually stagnate. And then that's another hurdle you have to overcome.
Okay, so as you got those 2 people that are working really well together, they have the community that they're building, the culture. When you separate them, is there a conversation that you have with them to let them know why that separation is happening?
100%. And typically it would happen before I did it. So I would be talking to them like, hey, I have this project coming down. I think it would make sense because you're doing so well together. Here's the things I really like, A, B, C, D. And I love that you work this way. I would like to instill that culture in another team. Here's why I may want to split it. You got to keep this culture over here rocking the way it is. So I want you to stay here and move you over here, or they can pick and choose. So you have that conversation ahead of time, because it may, like I said, it could end up being worse. So the worst thing you could do is be like, they don't want to go to the new project, they hate it. Then they actually create a toxic culture. So a lot of the moves I make, I will actually have conversations with individuals if I can before it happens, or like you said earlier, that you can see it kind of coming down. I can say, hey, I see a project 2 months out. No, this is coming. Would you be interested? Because then I may have to shift work to make sure that they're free at that point in time. So I think those conversations are important. And if you're not, then you're actually blindsiding your employees, and then it could become really bad.
Yeah, fully agree with that. Absolutely, good choice on that. Now, your management style is much different than what again, quote unquote, normal managers are. So you talk a lot about trying to develop that employee. What strategies do you find are effective in nurturing that growth and potential from your individual team members?
So there's a book I've read, and I have it written down in my notes. It's Drive: The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. It's a nonfiction book written by Daniel Pink. But what it talks about is autonomy, mastery, purpose. Those are three key things you can have, and you can that set up individuals to do more impactful work, and they do it on their own. So the goal is you kind of give the autonomy part of it is everyone has a desire to be self-directed, but not told what to do. Right? So it's hey, I would like you to figure out this thing, but I'm not telling you how to do it. Right? So you kind of help them build the autonomy. The mastery is just getting better skilled at things. And the purpose is understanding why or believing in the reason why you're doing something. So when you start looking at employees, and it's been a really recent big thought of mine is how do I do that? And you start finding when you're upskilling employees and you're helping them grow, you start finding usually we start with mastery. When you go from a software engineer to a senior software engineer, one of the biggest hurdles there is mastering your current set of skills. So you start there. Once they've kind of got to their satisfactory level of mastery, which I usually let them define. Do you think are you an Android engineer? Do you think you know your skill set good enough here? And you would like to start branching out, right? So you can start building mastery in another area. Or do you want to start leading a little bit more teams, or would you like to start partnering with other projects to have more autonomy and start figuring out what you solving the problems rather than building them? So you start looking at just how to motivate them. And usually that's just gaining skills because most humans, and there's a quote, and I don't remember who said it, most humans want to do good work. So assuming that humans don't want to do good work is a false statement. So by helping them just be hey, here's an opportunity, it aligns with your skill set, may make you grow. Here's how you do it. And then you say I don't know if I really want to do this. I don't know how to do this. It's great. That means one, it's an opportunity for you to grow. Two, if it interests you, that's great. And three, I probably, or in some way, shape, or form, know someone that did it, or I've done it myself. Right. So I can help coach you, support you through that situation, or I know someone who can. And I think that's kind of where you start looking at those angles instead of just saying, all right, go read a book. Maybe that is the solution, right? Some people, hey, I don't know this. Great, let's go drop $50. We'll go get you a book, or you can go do a training, things like that. But when you start getting into the senior realm, it's much more of just giving them experiences and finding those and talking through them. And that's how you really focus on them growing. And as a manager, so that's like a leader, you do that. But as a manager, you're also balancing the business aspect of it. So you're also responsible for making sure that you're putting your individuals in spots to grow and it's good for the business. So that purpose becomes a little bit easier in that sense because you're setting them up for here's why you should be doing this project. Here's why it's an important project. Here's how you're going to grow. Here's how you're going to support it. And then you move. That's typically how I go about it. It's just a lot of conversations. There's no one size fits all. Some people, they don't really want the help. They're just okay. And they'll only ask you for help when they need it. But some people are very, I have an individual who's very self-sufficient at going and finding his own problems. And he finds purpose and he's really good at that. And that is actually what's great about him. So I think it's just kind of how you support individuals throughout. There's no silver bullet to that.
Now, with this kind of aspect, have you noticed a shift since COVID? It seems like, from my experience, the workforce, okay, let's be honest, people in general, quote unquote, people in general, across the kids all the way through adults, seem to be less focused on further advancing themselves as a person after COVID. It seems like the amount of work that they want to put in or will factually put in is half or less than what it was prior to COVID. Have you experienced a similar type of thing, or all the way not?
I have not, and that's where it's interesting. And the reason I've heard this is the whole theory about people wanting to go back into the office. Like they return to office is the new thing coming in, and I am a remote employee. And I found that as a remote employee, I work really well remote because I used to drive an hour and a half every day, 3 hours. I have two kids, so I get to spend time with kids. I get to go to my daughter's t-ball and stuff like that. So it's much more rewarding, and I find myself actually working harder at work now than I did in the office because now I don't have the 15-minute coffee break because someone's come up to me and started talking about a random project they want to work on. I don't have the person stopping by my desk where I got to take my headphones out and stop what I was doing and do this. So I'm actually a little bit more effective. But I have noticed that it's harder to connect. And if you weren't measuring your teams already and you don't have a good sense of what a high performing employee or a well performing employee looks like, then you're struggling today because you've always relied on, well, they've got to have this feature done by this date. They've, people in person have been talking to you usually get a little bit more credit. So it's one of those things, instead of having less work being done, it's actually you're having to think more about how you evaluate people. And then now you're also having to think more about holding people accountable for their work, which I work at a startup too. So a lot of the team members I have are very invested in what they're doing. Now they have drawn hard boundaries between life and work. And I think that should be acceptable. I think there are times where you put in more hours, but there are also times where it should be okay that, hey, it's 5 o'clock. I'm shutting off my laptop for today. If there's an emergency, call me. But if there's a Slack message waiting for me when I get back on, I'm not going to jump on it and answer it that minute. So I haven't seen the less. I've actually seen almost people take more responsibility. And I think that is also just the culture of the people you work with too. I think it takes some people really thrive in office, other people thrive remote. I think some software engineers thrive really, really well at home because there's less people, they can be a little bit more introverted, which is what I used to be.
Well, and
Still
really,
kind
the
of.
type of work that you guys are doing, you don't need to be together to collaborate. You don't need to be in a physical environment. You can do that work at home, and so that's probably better for the actual business because they don't have to pay for a facility. I mean, I'm sure they probably have a facility, but they don't have to pay for an over huge facility with all these extra, workstations because you guys can all do it from home, and then that's less overhead for them, which means that's more that they can give to the employees and everybody across the entire business is benefiting from that.
It is, yeah, and on top of it, but that was during COVID. Now you have companies who have locked into those contracts, and I don't want to shame any company that's RTO because they think that's the right way to go. I'm sure in certain situations it actually is. But yeah, it is a little bit of a benefit, and I think also remote right now is the biggest benefit, in my opinion. Like we used to have companies who would say you get free coffee, we have ping pong tables, you have a cafeteria, you can do your laundry work. I think, which is what I think I've heard Google and those companies do. Which those are all great benefits, but those are encouraging you to stay there long hours. Now that I'm a father, my long hours are I'm going to get up early, I'm going to be present for them, and then I may work after they go to bed. So it's much more sacrificing my sleep rather than sacrificing my time. And right now, the biggest company perk I can have is actually flexibility. So that's why I think being remote is actually a big win. And now I go in every now and then. I think you can use going into the office and getting together as a tool, and then it becomes much more effective. Because when I go into the office, I haven't seen so and so in person. I've only talked to them on Zoom. I have a reason to go talk to them, and I have a reason to connect with them. And I'm also more willing to go out to a happy hour because I know that I'm in town for a certain amount of time. I'm going, I've said, hey, Tara, can you handle it at home for me? And she says yes. And then I will stay out late and do that. And rather than spare the moment stuff. So it's a little bit more intentional so you can get more out of it when you're in person.
Well, okay, so I imagine that as most of your work is virtual, you have to have an effective communication skills, and of course that's really the cornerstone to having a successful team, anyways. But as with that remote kind of aspect that's built in, how do you ensure clear and open communications with your team? And what advice could you share with leaders that are striving to help to achieve better communication?
So I'll start with what we have. And what we have is probably not ideal for every company. And we get feedback consistently. But the biggest things you can do for communication is have a way to a centralized tool and have an agreement on how you communicate. So we use Slack. We actually have a rules of Slack document that was created before I got there, but it's a fantastic idea. Where it's like, hey, here's if you have a problem and you would like to talk to a team, here's how you talk to them in Slack, so you know. Here's how, if you're working on a project, here's how you know where that is. So it's like a very organized communication path. And you try to keep stuff, you push for stuff to be public, which might be the anti-thought process there. But I've realized that if you start a conversation, like you and I were starting a conversation, and then I need to pull in a third person, because it wasn't a public channel, I've now got to go rehash all that information with them. So if you start public and you start that way, you can just like, hey, I need so and so, tag them in, they'll pull in, they can read the thread if it's not too long. So that's one complaint. But so you have those communication lines. And then the other thing is like if a Slack thread, say it gets 25 messages long, jump on a call. Don't be afraid to use an in-person meeting. Don't be afraid to say, hey, this is too long or there's a miscommunication happened. Let's just jump on a call. We'll spend 5 minutes hashing it out rather than 30 minutes typing it out. And we'll agree, and then we'll post the update in Slack. So having those rules is important. And then living those rules is also important. So empower your team members to say, if they got a DM, tell them, hey, push it out, and have them live that is important. So that's kind of the one way you do it. And then, like I said, the one-on-ones is important. We do have team meetings. Team meetings are hard, though, because you have to have value in those team meetings. You don't just want to have a meeting to have a meeting. So that's kind of how we approach it. It's not ideal, but it works for us for now. And then it'll evolve. If we got more team members, less team members, it would change.
But yeah, and I think, having one centralized hub for all of the interpersonal communication to be in one place, I think is very important. And I think that, of course, having a rules of engagement, as it were, for what that looks like for everybody. Okay, you got to follow these standard protocols. If it's X number of lines of messages back and forth long, make it a phone call, because that's going to be much less, much more convenient for your time. All of those things, I think that really leads to steering the people into the opportunity to have the best form of communication possible. And then everybody is following through on those parameters, so everybody knows what to expect. There's kind of a, maybe even a hierarchical order as far as that communication goes, which is really easy, I think, then for everybody to follow.
Yeah, and then the other thing we've also implemented is it's called an OSP. It's basically oh no, something emergency is happening, and we even have that documented. In the case of a system going down, here's how you respond, and that is in Slack you can post documents at the top of different discussions and things like that. So we have all those standard communications too, because I think, to your point, having those critical lines is important, but in emergencies, especially in emergencies, having that documented so the team knows how to react and communicate on those is important. And when it comes to the topic of emergencies, I've actually had companies actually do rehearsal emergencies, so you can see how they communicate and you can give feedback on like, here's how an emergency should look, here's how it should be handled, and things like that to even practice those type of communications.
Yeah, and what a creative idea for that. Now, as you are now been in the leader, the management position for some time, if you can think back, what advice would you give yourself as you were starting this? So what advice would you give, somebody that was working on managing or leading a team, for the first time? What advice do you think would be crucial for them to have to help set them off on the best foot possible?
It's okay to fail. I think that's the biggest thing. I think it's you come in, you've been so good at things for so long, you come in and management in itself is not a typical career path. Like it's something that you have to learn, and you're almost starting from ground zero. So cut yourself some slack. You will fail. You will make mistakes, but learn from those mistakes. So that's the first piece of advice I would give. Second piece of advice is talk to your team members and get feedback from them. See how they want to run things. Don't just come in and assume you know how it should go or how it will go. Be like, hey, how do we want to run this team? Here's my opinion. Do you all like this opinion? Some things are non-negotiable, but some things you like the culture that they will thrive in. You want to establish that culture as a group and then build on that over time because you're investing in those employees just as much as they're investing in you to learn. So you want them to stay around. And in software, that's not a common thing. Usually people leave 2 to 3 years. So if you can get people to stay 3 years plus, you're doing something right, hopefully, and you're building a good culture. So keeping that in mind. And then also be okay to take time for yourself. As a manager, you're doing a lot of giving. You're giving a lot of your time, your brain power to the people you manage, but also to your cross-functional stakeholders. You're listening to the feedback about your team, or you're giving feedback about their team, how they can be better prepared for things, or you're spending a lot of time analyzing it. And as a manager, as an individual contributor, you start out with like 4 to 6 hours of heads down work time a day. Sometimes it flexes that high. As a manager, it's actually the flip side, where you may only get 1 to 2 hours a day of actual heads down brain power time, and instead you're meeting with people trying to do projects or you're working on visions. It's just like there's a lot going on and you're task switching consistently. So be okay taking 5 to 10 minutes to yourself before lunch, after lunch, just midday, just to breathe, catch up on your own thoughts, write them down, and make sure you reflect on that and make that a standard practice, because otherwise you will become overwhelmed very quickly. Those are the 3 big things I would give.
Well, yeah, thank you. I have to say, one of the key takeaways for me that I'm going to implement this week. We have a weekly meeting every day, or every week on Friday, with the team that I help to lead, and I know one of the takeaways that we're going to do is we generally do as a group meeting where we talk about the happenings of the week. We talk about a little bit of what's coming up next, and we do a little bit of hands-on training just to make sure everybody's on the same board. But something after our discussion today here that I'm going to take away and share with them and practice with them is that individual time. I think we'll have the group time, we'll have the instruction time, but I want to have the individual time. I think that opportunity to think about what excites them about coming to work, what they would like to do next, and what the horizons look like, maybe even a little bit beyond that, just so I can get a better sense of connection with them. I get a better idea of what they like to do, and it gives me insight in what they think, at least, that they do good at, so then I can put them into those positions so they can excel. But that's going to better build that connection with them, with the environment, and so on. So I think that was a very key takeaway. So thank you for that so much.
You're welcome. And another one that I would highly recommend is find ways to receive feedback about yourself and build a culture that people are okay giving that feedback to you, which as a manager, that's very tough for me to receive. Like it's very hard to not have a negative reaction to someone giving you feedback because it's something you've got to learn. But having that 2-way door with employees is I have found to be extremely valuable, especially in the last 3-4 years of like taking that feedback, acting on it is critical. So if you can add that to anything you do too, I think that every manager should have that and listen to their team members.
Well, thank you, John. Now, before we wrap up, do you have any key takeaways or final thoughts you'd like to leave our audience with?
No, I don't. Well, no, I don't, not any key takeaways. It's been one of those. I think I've given a lot of points on this. But I'm happy if you get any feedback about the episode, about any questions or stuff, I'm happy to come on or talk to people independently about any other ideas they may have themselves. Because there really is. There's no playbook. Well, people say there's a playbook, but there's not really a playbook because people are unique in every way. So there's no simple solution to that, to the way people work.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing your time, your expertise on this. And to our listeners, stay tuned for more enriching episodes. Until next time, this is the Prestigious Initiative.